It is precisely because I'm Singaporean that I'm telling you to run away from autocracy. Run far away and never look back. Because my individual rights and dignity are not for sale. I'm going to talk to you about two things. One, I'm going to talk to you about people and democracy. And second, I'm going to talk to you about the economy and better financial and monetary decisions. First, on the people and democracy. Now, we started from the very intuitive principle that self-determination doesn't come in parts. And if you believe in democracy, and if you believe that autonomous individuals have the right to decide for their country, then we cannot exclude the population from one half of our economic toolkit. Because if we already allow individuals to decide on things like fiscal policy, on complex taxation policy, then we cannot exclude individuals from deciding on monetary policy, on interest rates, and the strength of the currency, because all the arguments that opposition provided also apply to things like fiscal policy. What do we hear? One, we don't let people vote unless they are in a good place to do so. What does this even mean? My mother gets to vote on taxation even though she knows nothing about Friedman or Keynes. That we argue that Americans get to vote on foreign policy in Syria even though they know next to nothing about the factional and sectarian interests in their country. No thank you. By this logic, we should all be ruled by a team of philosopher kings who dictate what we do in our lives all the time. But we don't. Because democracy is not about making the right decision all the time, but avoiding the very worst ones. The worst decisions come when you are unaccountable to the public and are insulated from popular discourse. And that's exactly what my first speaker told you. Notice how they never rebutted the specific links to their logic. How individuals are always held accountable to the oligopolies of financial markets, and how the big firms always hold fast over such individuals. We had no response. But the next thing we heard, people are uneducated. They're too stupid for economics. I posit to you that you don't need a doctorate in monetary policy to understand the broad mechanisms that central banks employ and the outcomes they generate. This is because we directly interact with these policies on a daily basis. For a middle-class entrepreneur, he doesn't understand the specific mechanism of an interest rate, but he knows that if an interest rate goes up, it makes it harder and more expensive for him to borrow and invest. No, thank you. For example, a Malaysian rubber tapper, the most uneducated people opposition to talk to you about, may not understand the intricacies of foreign exchanges. But he understands how a stronger Malaysian dollar affects how much he can earn by exporting that rubber. That's the premise of all democratic decisions. That we don't remove your right to self-determination just because you lack perfect information. We've already shown you how citizens have access to such meaningful information through our model. Things like the radio, which like 60% of all Indian farmers listen to. We should talk to you about the popular media, about print media, about mass media, and draw parallels to all other democratic decisions. But before I go on, yes?
Sir, the people with PhDs making these decisions don't even know their outcomes. How do you expect a person, even if they get an...
Thanks, sir. Well, it's precisely because the people with PhDs don't know about the outcomes that we need to crowdsource what people want. We think that it's precisely because you agree on both sides. The outcomes of monetary policy are sometimes unpredictable, that we need to err on the side of democratic discourse and democratic principle, something that you've never rebutted down the line. But back to my case. Now, the second speaker forwarded an insane stance. Autocracy is great until people die. What? Because we argue that people have rights, that individuals have autonomous agency, that we should be allowed the conditions upon which we live, and the autonomous actions in which we do, and the environment in which we live in. We argue that we cannot subject individuals into a condition upon which they have no control in. That is the entire premise upon which we make all other autonomous decisions and build societies, ladies and gentlemen. Don't let them tell you that autonomy is great until we have blood on our hands. Now, we argue, finally, that democracy is the worst form of government except for every other that we've tried. It is very tempting for us in debates to tell us that we know better. But every time someone has tried to dictate for people, they have failed. And that's what my first speaker told you about the housing bubble crash and as the central banks stood by. I'm going to move on to my second area of analysis, that of making better economic decisions. Now, we have shown you down the line how decisions on monetary policy are always subjective, and that people gravitate towards what they want. What we heard, people can decide broad objectives, but not the process. How do they do it? They told us exactly about growth, unemployment, and inflation as key targets for a central bank. But it's precisely because these three tenets of monetary policy are contradictory that cannot get individuals to decide this broad premise with ever any alternative that they propose. What are they going to do? Make people protest and say, we want less unemployment on the streets? That's not the kind of involvement they want individuals to be engaged in, ladies and gentlemen. They have no solution for individuals to decide these broad principles. But they might come up to us and tell us, no, you can vote in parties who will then appoint chairmen of such banks. Come on, ladies and gentlemen. These are political parties who insulate their appointees and raise them up from environments in which are controlled by these big firms. Environments where they do not have contact with the common man, are unable to reach out and empathize with such situations. And it's precisely because of that we can't have political parties as an intermediary or representation. If they so want representation, then do away with political parties acting as the intermediary for such central bankers, we argue, have the direct system. The next thing we heard, you can fire them if they do a bad job. First of all, that is just untrue. Bernanke stood by as the housing bubble burst in 2008. Guess what? He stayed in job. The reason why you can't is because their policy in the real world, you are locked in for your term. But even if you could, even if I could just, fire a bank chairman, we argue that, that's bad because on their side, they can't stand for long-term policies and at the same time stand for trigger-happy boards of economic directors. Especially because economists can't agree on what's the best way forward for economies all the time. That's why there are competing schools of economics, right? The New Age liberal Keynesian economics and the neo-conservative Friedman people. And what we argue here is it's precisely because of this uncertainty that they encourage such trigger-happy economic boards and they undermine all they talk to us about their long-term policy tension in their case. What we argue here is that it's precisely because such decisions are not objective, but subjective in nature, that we need to leave it to the people. We present them manifestos, broad outlines and directions of where they want to go, and based on this, and based on the credentials and the track record of candidates on display, then they vote for such aggregated decisions and what's best for the nations. The last thing we heard, short-term versus long-term decisions, and we should all fear populism. Now, first of all, the concept of difficult but necessary is incredibly slippery. What's wrong with alleviating short-term unemployment with increasing real incomes of poor farmers if that comes at the cost of long-term growth? Listen to the privileged language that they were employing on their side. There's an objective good. You don't know it now. Stay unemployed. It's alright. Have lower incomes. It's fine because in the long term, it'll be okay. That runs in the face of every single democratic decision and every single principle of individual agency that we are called individuals. That we believe that individuals should be able to decide what's best for themselves, even if this comes at the cost of long-term decisions. If you don't know about these long-term decisions, that's what elections are for politicians as well as such chairmen and candidates for such positions to talk about these things, engage in public debates, a model that my first speaker told you about. And furthermore, we argue they've never dealt on our argument about they undermine the effectiveness of monetary policy. We argue that the livelihoods of many cannot be dictated by